The sun hung low in the sky over the pristine shores of Cuba, painting the horizon in a watercolor blur of fiery oranges and gentle purples. Miles Bennett leaned back in his lounge chair, nursing his second mojito of the afternoon. Around him, the world seemed like a carefully curated dream, white sand that felt like silk underfoot, the rhythmic whisper of the turquoise waves, and laughter carried on the humid breeze. To anyone watching, Miles had everything. At 39, his hard work in corporate management afforded him luxuries most only dreamed of, this extravagant vacation to Havana, for instance. He'd booked the trip as a surprise for his wife, Amber, to celebrate their 10th anniversary. She was a vision, even now as she waded waist-deep into the surf, her golden blonde hair catching the light like a halo. If someone had asked Miles about his marriage just a few weeks ago, he would have described it as comfortable. There were ups and downs, as in any relationship, but 10 years was no small feat. They shared good moments, Christmas mornings curled up on the couch, spontaneous weekends at the cabin, and memories that lingered in photo albums back home. And yet, as he watched Amber laugh with an ease he hadn't seen in years, something twisted in his chest, a flicker of unease that had no name. Amber turned and waved. "Come on, lazybones. The water's perfect." Miles waved back with a grin, but he didn't join her. His thoughts were like a persistent itch he couldn't scratch. The truth was, something had changed between them recently, and Miles couldn't pinpoint when it began. Amber had become distracted, restless even. She stayed out later than usual, citing dinners with old friends or errands that never seemed to end. And then there was the trip itself. A month ago, Amber had suddenly begun nudging him to book a vacation, a getaway to reconnect, she'd called it. But Miles had caught the flicker of something else in her eyes, something just beneath the surface. Guilt? Or was it something darker, something he didn't want to acknowledge? He shook his head, taking another long sip of his drink. It's just paranoia. That was the story he told himself, one he was desperate to believe. The evening unfolded like a postcard-perfect scene. Miles and Amber sat at an oceanside table beneath strings of glowing lanterns, their wine glasses catching the light. The music of a Cuban quartet drifted through the humid night air, and the scent of grilled seafood hung heavy around them. Amber's dress, a simple white slip of silk, clung to her like mist. She looked ethereal, otherworldly, and for a moment, Miles felt that quiet flicker of love and admiration that had drawn him to her years ago. He raised his glass. To us. Amber smiled, her teeth flashing in the lantern glow. To 10 years of everything. Miles' smile faltered. The word sounded hollow, an odd toast for a milestone. Everything, he repeated softly. Amber shrugged playfully. Good times, bad times. You know, marriage. Something in her tone irked him. Miles opened his mouth to respond and the waiter approached with their entrees. Conversation shifted to safer topics, memories of their travels, plans for the future. But even as they laughed and reminisced, Miles couldn't ignore the strange tension crackling like static between them. That night, as the waves lapped against the shore outside their room, Miles awoke with a start. He turned over to find Amber's side of the bed empty. Frowning, he pushed the covers back and got up, his bare feet silent against the tile floor. The balcony door was ajar, and there she was, Amber, standing at the railing, her phone glowing in her hand. She hadn't noticed him yet, her thumb darting quickly across the screen as she typed. Miles hesitated, watching her silhouette bathed in moonlight. Every instinct told him to return to bed, pretend he hadn't seen a thing. But a darker part of him, a part fueled by sleepless nights and nagging suspicions, compelled him forward. Amber, he called softly. She flinched, nearly dropping the phone as she spun around. Miles. Her smile was brittle, too quick. You scared me. Couldn't sleep, he asked, stepping closer. Yeah. I didn't want to wake you. She slipped the phone into her pocket, her movement stiff. The waves are so loud tonight, aren't they? Miles studied her face, searching for something, anything, that might explain the sudden secrecy. Who were you texting? Amber's expression faltered, but only for a split second. Just Lindsay. She's asking how the trip's going. At midnight? Amber crossed her arms, her voice turning defensive. Time zones, Miles. She's back in New York. Miles held her gaze, the air between them thick with unspoken words. Finally, he nodded and forced a smile. Come back to bed. You'll feel better in the morning. Amber exhaled, her shoulders relaxing as though she'd narrowly avoided something. You're right. I'm just tired. But as she slipped past him and returned to their bed, Miles lingered on the balcony. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his own phone, staring at the screen. Amber's words echoed in his mind, just Lindsay. Except Miles had noticed something before she'd slipped the phone away. The screen wasn't displaying a text thread. It had been opened to a photo gallery, an image that looked like an unfamiliar face, a man's face. The unease returned, a slow, creeping weight settling in Miles' gut. The morning sun over Havana should have promised serenity, but to Miles, it painted the room in stark, unforgiving light. The air conditioning hummed softly, but he felt a bead of sweat traced down his neck. Amber lay beside him, her breathing steady, one hand splayed across the sheets, her wedding band catching the sunlight. Miles sat up slowly, careful not to wake her, his thoughts still circling the events of the night before. The balcony. The phone. The unfamiliar face. He ran a hand through his hair, his jaw tightening. He'd always considered himself a rational man, not one prone to suspicion or jealousy. But something gnawed at him, a feeling that refused to quiet. His gaze fell to Amber's phone, face down on the nightstand, as though daring him to act. For a moment, Miles hesitated. Trust. That's what marriage is built on, right? He wanted to believe Amber's story, wanted to believe he was imagining it all. But doubts were a poison, and once they took root, they spread fast. Finally, he reached for the phone. The screen lit up as he pressed his thumb to the power button, locked. Amber had never locked her phone before. He exhaled sharply, a tight knot forming in his chest. Why now? Miles? Amber's voice jolted him, and he fumbled to drop the phone back onto the table. He turned to find her watching him, eyes narrowing just slightly. What are you doing? He forced a laugh, a half-hearted attempt at nonchalance. Your alarm was buzzing. I was just checking. Her gaze lingered on him, unreadable. After what felt like an eternity, she stretched lazily, a yawn escaping. You didn't sleep well, did you? She asked, her voice smooth but oddly distant. Too much sun yesterday, I guess, he replied, avoiding her eyes as he stood up. I'm going to grab a shower. As the water pounded against him, Miles braced his hands on the cool tile of the shower wall, the sound of his ragged breathing competing with the rushing water. Was he overthinking it? Or was Amber hiding something big? The day wore on in a haze of tense silences and forced smiles. Miles couldn't shake the feeling that Amber was watching him just as closely as he was watching her. At breakfast, they sat on the open-air terrace of the resort, the bright colors of tropical fruit on their plates clashing with the gray cloud hanging between them. So, what's on the agenda today? Amber asked, stabbing at a slice of pineapple with her fork. She sounded upbeat, but Miles caught the faint edge in her voice. Carefully practiced. I was thinking we could head into town, Miles said, watching her reaction. Do some exploring. See the old streets, the markets. Amber's fork paused midair before she smiled, a bit too brightly. That sounds wonderful. I'll grab my camera after breakfast. They wandered through Havana's cobbled streets later that morning, surrounded by vibrant buildings and the lively bustle of street vendors. Amber seemed to relax, occasionally snapping photos of the architecture or laughing with locals, but Miles couldn't fully lose himself in the moment. Something's wrong. I can feel it. As they neared a small plaza, a street musician approached Amber, handing her a single red rose. For the beautiful lady, he said in a heavy accent. Amber blushed, her smile radiant as she accepted the flower. Gracias. Miles watched the exchange with a strange sense of unease. It wasn't the gesture itself, it was how easily Amber slid into that role, the charming stranger catching everyone's eye. It reminded him of the way she'd laughed the night before, carefree in a way she rarely was with him anymore. They paused at a cafe along the edge of the plaza, Amber setting her camera down to sip a fresh coconut drink. Miles leaned back in his chair, studying her closely. Amber, can I ask you something? She looked up, her smile faltering for just a second. Of course. You've been different lately. Distant, maybe. Is everything okay? Amber's gaze dropped briefly to the table before she forced a laugh. You're imagining things, Miles. It's just work stress, and we've been overdue for a vacation. That's all. Is it? He pressed, his tone calm but firm. Her jaw tightened. Yes, it is. Miles, are we really going to do this now? Do what? Amber shook her head, frustration flaring in her eyes. Have some weird interrogation in the middle of Havana? It's our vacation, can we not ruin it with whatever this is? He hesitated, studying her face. Fine, he said at last, his voice low. Let's forget it. But he didn't forget. That evening, Miles excused himself after dinner, claiming he wasn't feeling well. Amber didn't argue, and as soon as she disappeared toward the resort's pool area, Miles sprang into action. He wasn't proud of what he was about to do, of what it would mean for his marriage, but he had to know the truth. Moving quickly, he returned to their room and pulled out his laptop. Miles wasn't tech-savvy by any stretch, but a friend at work had once shown him how to log into shared iCloud accounts. He wasn't even sure if Amber still synced her phone, but it was worth a shot. The screen loaded slowly, every second stretching painfully. When the folders finally appeared, photos, texts, notes, Miles felt a chill creep up his spine. His hands shook as he clicked on the photo album. Rows of thumbnails filled the screen, images from their trip, selfies of Amber smiling at the beach. But as he scrolled, a new folder caught his attention. It was dated 2 days before their vacation. The title was simple and chilling, Private. Miles hesitated, a part of him screaming to stop, to look away. But he clicked it anyway. The first image was innocuous, a view of a hotel room that wasn't theirs. The next showed Amber, sitting on the edge of an unfamiliar bed, laughing at the camera. Miles' heart pounded as he flipped to the next image. There was a man. Dark-skinned, tall, and sharply dressed, he leaned casually against the headboard, his arm draped across Amber's bare shoulders. Her expression was unmistakable, intimate, trusting. Miles felt his stomach drop as if the floor had been ripped out beneath him. He scrolled further, images of them walking hand in hand, kissing in shadowed corners. The final photo hit him like a hammer, Amber asleep in the stranger's arms, the sheets tangled around them. For a moment, all Miles could hear was the roaring in his ears. He slammed the laptop shut, bile rising in his throat. The truth was laid bare, ugly and undeniable. Amber hadn't just betrayed him, she'd chosen someone else. Someone who could never be mistaken for Miles. He sat in the silence of their room, his breaths ragged and shallow. Images of their life together flashed through his mind, their wedding day, the first house they'd bought, anniversary spent curled up by the fire. He clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white. Why, Amber, he whispered to the empty room. Why would you throw it all away? The door handle rattled, and Miles' head snapped up. Amber stepped inside, her skin glowing from the pool lights outside. Hey, she said softly. You okay? You look pale. Miles swallowed the lump in his throat, forcing himself to meet her eyes. He smiled, a smile so calm, so steady, it almost didn't feel like his own. Yeah, he said. I'm fine. But he wasn't fine. And Amber had no idea what was coming next. The warm breeze off Havana's harbor tugged at Miles' shirt as he stood on their balcony, watching Amber sip coffee at the cafe below. She looked serene, innocent even. But the images he'd seen on his laptop the night before told a story far removed from the woman he thought he'd married. Miles clenched the railing, forcing himself to take slow, measured breaths. He wanted to confront her immediately, to demand answers, to unleash the storm building inside him. But he held back. No, not yet. If she was bold enough to lie this blatantly, then he would be patient enough to expose her completely. Amber had mentioned wanting to spend the day exploring the resort's shops, buying souvenirs for friends back home. Miles decided to seize the opportunity. Over breakfast, he casually mentioned his plan. I think I'm going to take a walk along the harbor, he said, his voice even. Clear my head a bit. I'll be back by evening. Amber looked up from her menu, surprised. You don't want to come with me? I thought we could shop together, maybe grab lunch in town. Miles smiled faintly, shaking his head. You know me, not really a souvenir guy. Besides, you'll enjoy it more without me hovering around. Her lips curled into a smile, and for a fleeting moment, Miles wondered if she felt relief at his absence. Okay, she said lightly. But don't be gone too long. Maybe we can catch the sunset together later. Absolutely, Miles said, meaning none of it. Once Amber left the resort lobby, her straw bag swinging carelessly at her side, Miles followed at a discreet distance. The streets of Havana were busy with tourists and locals, providing ample cover as he trailed her through the bustling avenues. She moved with purpose, glancing at her phone occasionally as though checking instructions. Miles' stomach churned. What are you up to, Amber? Where are you going? She turned down a quieter street, the noise of the city dimming as colorful buildings loomed closer together. Miles ducked into a doorway, watching as Amber approached a modest cafe with outdoor seating. His breath caught when a man emerged from inside, the man from the photos. Tall and broad-shouldered, the Cuban man wore a casual button-down shirt and khaki slacks that hung on his frame with effortless ease. His smile was wide, his demeanor confident as he greeted Amber with a hug that lingered too long to be platonic. Miles gripped the edge of the doorway, his knuckles whitening. He couldn't hear their conversation, but he didn't need to. The way Amber's hand rested lightly on the man's arm, the way she tilted her head when she laughed, those gestures were loud enough. After a few minutes, they left the cafe together, walking side by side. Miles followed, keeping a safe distance, his pulse pounding in his ears. They returned to the resort mid-afternoon, entering through a side entrance far from the main lobby. Miles slipped in behind them, hanging back as they made their way to the elevators. His heart thundered as he watched Amber press the button for their floor, her voice light and teasing as she spoke to the man beside her. She's bringing him to our room. Miles felt a cold rage seep into his veins, freezing his breath in his lungs. But he remained calm, his movements deliberate. He took the stairs two at a time, arriving at the hall in time to see Amber slip her keycard into the lock. The door opened, and the pair disappeared inside. Miles waited, his fists clenched at his sides. A few minutes passed, long enough for his fury to grow unbearable. Then, without hesitation, he strode to the door and shoved it open. Amber and the man froze, caught mid-embrace near the foot of the bed. Amber's face went ashen, her eyes widening in sheer panic. The Cuban man stepped back, his expression hardening as though preparing for a confrontation. Miles. Amber gasped, her voice high-pitched and frantic. What are you doing here? I thought you were at the harbor. Miles closed the door behind him with a calm that belied the storm inside him. He stepped further into the room, his gaze locked on Amber. What am I doing here? He repeated, his voice low and sharp. That's a good question, Amber. But maybe you should answer first. What's he doing here? Amber's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted to the man beside her, as if searching for an escape. The Cuban man squared his shoulders. This isn't what it looks like, he said, his voice thick with an accent but steady. Miles turned his glare on him, his jaw tightening. Isn't it? Because it looks a hell of a lot like my wife brought a stranger into our room, on our anniversary trip. Amber stepped forward, her hands outstretched as though to calm him. Miles, please, let me explain. Oh, I'm dying to hear this one, Miles interrupted, his tone cold. Go ahead, Amber. Explain why I've been following you all day. Explain the photos on your phone. Explain him. Amber's face crumpled, tears welling in her eyes. It's not what you think. We're friends. It's not serious, Miles. It doesn't mean anything. Friends? Miles barked a bitter laugh, his anger finally spilling over. Is that what we're calling it now? Friends who meet in hotel rooms? Friends who kiss? Friends who sleep in the same bed? The Cuban man took a step forward, his tone cautious but firm. I think you should leave. This is between me and Amber. Miles' head snapped toward him, his fury igniting like a spark to gasoline. Between you and Amber, he snarled. That's rich. Let me make something very clear, you are nothing here. Nothing. The man tensed, but Amber quickly stepped between them, her voice trembling. Miles, stop. Please. This is my fault. Just, let him go. I'll explain everything, but please, don't make this worse. Miles stared at her, his chest heaving. For a long moment, the room was silent except for the hum of the air conditioner. Then, slowly, he stepped back. You're right, he said, his voice like ice. This is your fault. And I'm done giving you the benefit of the doubt, Amber. We're finished. Amber's sobs filled the room as the Cuban man stood frozen, unsure whether to stay or go. Miles didn't care. He walked out, slamming the door behind him, the sound reverberating down the hallway like a gunshot. 9 months later, the air in the hospital room was thick with tension, almost suffocating. Miles sat in the corner, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, watching Amber as she cradled the newborn in her arms. The sterile white walls, the hum of medical equipment, the faint cries of other infants down the hallway, everything seemed muted, like the world had lost its color. But this room, this scene, burned with a cruel clarity. The baby had been born just hours earlier, and Amber was staring down at him with a mix of love and hesitation. He was a healthy boy, full of life, his little fingers curled tightly into a fist. But there was no mistaking it, his skin was a shade darker than either Miles or Amber's. His tiny features were distinct, undeniably reflecting someone else. Someone who wasn't Miles. Miles couldn't tear his eyes away from the child. For months, he'd hoped against hope that this was all a cruel misunderstanding, a nightmare that would evaporate in the light of day. But as the baby's first cries filled the room, the truth cemented itself like concrete in his chest. Amber broke the silence. Miles, her voice was weak, tentative. She looked up, tears streaming down her cheeks. Please. I can explain. Miles' lips curled into a bitter smile, his tone sharper than broken glass. Explain. I think we're past that, don't you? Amber flinched, holding the baby closer as though to shield him from the invisible war between them. It was a mistake, she whispered. I never meant for this to happen. Miles stood slowly, his movements deliberate, controlled, a stark contrast to the hurricane of emotions swirling inside him. A mistake, he repeated, shaking his head. 9 months ago, I caught you red-handed with that man in our room. You lied to my face, Amber. Over and over. This, he gestured toward the baby, isn't a mistake. It's the result of your choices. Choices you knew would destroy everything. Amber broke into quiet sobs, but Miles felt nothing, no sympathy, no pity. The betrayal had carved him hollow. He turned toward the door, his voice low and steady. I'll be speaking to a lawyer first thing tomorrow. We're done, Amber. She looked up in desperation, her tear-streaked face pale. Miles, please. Don't do this. I made a mistake, but we can get through this. I need you. You need me. Miles interrupted, his voice rising just slightly. When did you ever think about what I needed, Amber? Or what this would do to us? You've made your bed, and now you can lie in it, alone. And with that, he walked out, leaving her sobs echoing behind him. The divorce process began almost immediately. For Miles, it wasn't just about ending the marriage, it was about justice. About holding Amber accountable for the betrayal that had shattered their lives. He wanted her to feel the weight of her decisions, to understand the consequences of the lies she had spun so effortlessly. Amber's inheritance, a fortune left to her 2 years earlier by her late grandfather, was at the center of the legal proceedings. The 5 apartments she owned in Manhattan were her pride and joy, properties her grandfather had painstakingly accumulated over decades. Amber had always seen them as her safety net, her legacy. And now, they were on the table. Amber's lawyer argued fiercely, claiming the apartments were her personal property and exempt from any divorce settlement. But Miles' legal team, armed with meticulous preparation and unshakable determination, tore through every defense Amber put up. The judge reviewed the case thoroughly, ultimately ruling in Miles' favor. In the end, the verdict was clear: Miles was entitled to half of Amber's estate, including 3 of the 5 apartments in New York City. The judge's words echoed through the courtroom like a gavel striking finality. Amber sat motionless at the defendant's table, her face pale, her eyes hollow. The loss of her property stung almost as deeply as the dissolution of her marriage. For the first time, the consequences of her betrayal felt real, tangible. Miles watched her from across the room, his expression unreadable. There was no satisfaction in his victory, only a cold sense of closure. He stood as the judge adjourned, turning on his heel and walking out of the courtroom without so much as a backward glance. The months that followed were a whirlwind of change. Miles sold 2 of the apartments, securing a small fortune that would allow him to live comfortably for the rest of his life. The 3rd apartment, a sleek penthouse overlooking Central Park, he decided to keep for himself. The space was far too big for just one person, but Miles liked the quiet, the emptiness. It suited him now. The divorce had made headlines briefly, tabloids spinning Amber's infidelity into a salacious scandal. Wife's affair with mystery man costs her millions, was plastered across newsstands for weeks. Friends reached out with half-hearted apologies, whispering about how shocking the whole situation had been. Miles ignored it all, focusing on rebuilding the pieces of his life that Amber had nearly destroyed. Every so often, he thought of the baby, Amber's son. A child born into chaos, into the shadow of his mother's choices. Miles felt no anger toward him. The boy was innocent, after all. But he knew he could never look at him without seeing the ghost of a betrayal that still haunted him. One evening, as Miles stood on the balcony of his new apartment, a glass of whiskey in his hand, he looked out over the city skyline. The setting sun cast long golden streaks across the buildings, the lights beginning to twinkle one by one like distant stars. For the first time in a long time, Miles felt something close to peace. He'd lost his marriage, but he'd gained freedom. He'd been betrayed, but he'd come out stronger. And now, as the city stretched endlessly before him, he realized something important. He was no longer the man who had stood helplessly on that balcony in Cuba, watching his wife's lies unravel. That man was gone, left behind in the ashes of a marriage that had already been burning. This was a new beginning. A richer one. What would you do if you discovered such a betrayal? Is justice served here, or did Miles take it too far? Share your thoughts below.